privileged guy, a journalist, like me. My wife used to see him in Greenwich Village, running or rollerblading, princely handsome. I found myself wondering, why are we still so connected to these reckless and beautiful Kennedys? What do they represent, especially to those of us with Irish blood? What do we want from them? And why do they keep dying? Though I'd never nursed the default Irish-American deification of the flawed and famous Kennedys, America's royal family and all that, I felt an unexpected sadness. Not so much at the apparent conclusion of Camelot, but at the failed promise of a once poor immigrant family. Looking around at the lights and cameras, the tearful tourists trying to catch a glimpse of Ted, last of the famed sons, I also wondered how and when and where and why did it all start. I knew the shorthand version: Joe Kennedy, the driven patriarch, the movie mogul and financier, the liquor importer and controversial ambassador, who willed and bankrolled his sons to power. I also knew that Joe had lacked interest in his family's humble past. "We're Americans now," he'd insist. But how did the Kennedys become American? And who came first? After filing my last story, I checked out of the Cuddle and Bubble Motel and drove south to my wife and toddler sons. Passing through New Jersey, state of my birth, I came within a mile of my Irish grandparents' graves. His name was Patrick, and hers was Bridget, though when she'd arrived at Ellis Island, she gave the name Della. Bridget was too much of a stereotype, synonymous with poor Irish maid, which is exactly how she began her life in America. She'd been dead for a decade. He'd been gone more than half a century, having left her widowed and living in public housing with 3 kids, one of them my mother. As I drove past on I-95 that day, leaving behind my grandparents and the grieving Kennedys and pondering the immigrant source of their story and mine, I felt something awaken. Until then, while I rooted for Notre Dame, my father's alma mater, identified as Irish Catholic, easy enough in a town of Quinns, McCarthys, and Murphys, and attended 16 years of Catholic school, I hadn't thought too deeply about my Irish roots, the Kennedys, or any of that. Having had a sister with Down syndrome, I did appreciate the family that helped create the Special Olympics, in which my sister competed. But not until JFK Jr.'s plunge into the Atlantic did something click. That Dead Kennedy episode aroused my simmering Irishness, and though I didn't realize it at the time, that's when this book began. Years later, amid the stirred-up cries to build that wall and send them back, my curiosity was reignited. I wanted to know more about the anti-immigrant low points in our history, and found most of the 19th century packed with shameful examples: the anti-Catholic Know-Nothings, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Immigration Restriction League, alongside the parallel efforts to keep blacks enslaved, and, even after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the turbulent period of Reconstruction, disenfranchised. For much of that transformational century, the Irish were tops among America's feared and despised outsiders, coming to take your jobs and import their crime and their freaky religion. As the grandson of immigrants, of those hopeful outsiders who often faced disdain or worse, I also sought to find inspiration in a story about America as a welcoming nation, of and for newcomers. In revisiting the Kennedys' origins, I've tried to understand how one family evolved, within a few generations, from loathsome invaders to one of the most powerful and beloved families in U.S. history. While plenty has been written about the 20th century Kennedys, none of it would have been possible without the heroic yet overlooked lives of a poor immigrant couple named Bridget and Patrick. It all began 150 years before John Jr.'s death, in fact, just north of where he died, when his great-great-grandparents sailed into Boston Harbor, having left the country that couldn't sustain them.